Okay, everyone, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the second seminar in our series on building capacity for sustainable development. We're delighted that you're here with us today. We have organized this seminar series at a time when the pursuit of sustainability is increasingly hindered by the impacts of climate change, extinction, war, inequality, and rising authoritarianism. At the same time, substantial progress is being made both in scholarly understanding of the dynamics of sustainable development and in real-world achievements across scales from global to local. We believe that now more than ever, it's important to recognize these achievements and understand how they have come about and can be built on by change agents who remain committed to the goals of sustainable development. The seminar series therefore seeks to integrate insights from scholars and practitioners on how to strengthen strategic capacities for addressing the multiple intertwined crises of the Anthropocene and better pursue sustainability moving forward. Today's seminar focuses on adaptive capacity. Other seminars in the series have focused on measurement, will focus on transformative capacity, the capacity to advance equity, the capacity to govern cooperatively, and the capacity to link knowledge with action. These six capacities come out of a synthesis of scholarship across the many disciplines that contribute to the field of sustainability science. As part of the Capacity Building for Sustainable Development Research Project, we are now working to deepen our understanding of how to build and maintain these capacities in practice. This seminar series focused on the experience and insights of leading practitioners is part of this project. We hope you will join us for as many of these seminars as possible. Having trouble advancing the slides. Apologies. Today's seminar zeroes in on the capacity to adapt development pathways to protect human well-being. What do we mean by this? Well, central to the pursuit of sustainability is the ability of actors to navigate disruptive change so that they can survive long enough to hopefully transition to more equitable development pathways moving into the future. The increasing turbulence of the Earth system makes this especially important today. Meeting these challenges will require building and maintaining a sustainability-focused capacity to adapt, which we take here as the ability to confront potentially disruptive change in ways that keep the system operating in pursuit of inclusive human well-being within its current regime, and thus on something like the current development pathway. Such a capacity will almost certainly require addressing four separate but interrelated challenges. First, we need to reduce sources of vulnerability, particularly among the most vulnerable people and places. Second, we need to mitigate harmful shocks and sources of disruptive change. Third, we need to create more and more equitable access to the resources that people and communities need to recover from shocks and navigate future development pathways moving forward. And finally, we need to strengthen adaptation-focused governance structures that help actors across levels navigate trade-offs across both space and time that inevitably crop up in efforts to pursue sustainability. We look forward to hearing from our panelists today about their own extensive experiences building adaptive capacity. We have a fantastic group of 3 speakers today that have deep expertise in both the science and practice of adaptation. They come from different continents and approach the challenge of adaptation from different sectors and perspectives. But what they have in common is a theory-grounded approach to building adaptive capacity in ways that are more equitably improve human well-being. They are Carolyn Kousky from the Environmental Defense Fund, Aditi Mukherji from the CGIAR, and Claudia Thyme from the Insurance Development Forum. I'm going to actually let each of them introduce themselves more fully as they just do such a better job of introducing themselves than I will. So Caroline, I'd love to hear from you about your background and how you think about building adaptive capacity within your work.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be a part of this discussion. So I'm currently the Associate Vice President for Economics at Environmental Defense Fund, where I also oversee our climate and insurance work. Before that, I directed a risk management center at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania. And before that, I spent a decade at an environmental economics think tank in Washington, D.C., where I went after getting my PhD at Harvard's Kennedy School. So it's a delight to be a part of this series. Throughout that time, most of my work, I would say, has been focused on the third category of adaptive capacity that was mentioned in the background paper, that of creating more and more equitable access to the resources that people and communities need to recover from negative shocks. So for me, that's involved research on the impact of various disasters, typically with a focus on climate-related extremes, how they impact household finances, how they impact public sector budgets and our housing, mortgage, and insurance markets. I've been really interested in where the private and public sector intersect and how we design effective institutional and governance frameworks around risk management, and how we design sort of the public sector programs and public sector interventions around both disaster aid and insurance. I think I started my career as a researcher, and I still am a little bit, but I've also been sort of moving more and more into policy and community engagement over the past several years. But through all of that, a sort of key focus of mine has been on how we manage disasters, with an emphasis on how we respond and recover. So that's led me to spend a lot of time thinking about disaster insurance. I've written a whole book on it, Understanding Disaster Insurance, and now founded a new nonprofit called Insurance for Good. You can look us up at insuranceforgood.org, which is focused only on the US. And it's focused on helping communities, NGOs, and the public sector harness risk transfer solutions to help them achieve their broader social and environmental goals. And I want to say, and this might set the stage for some of our conversations later, that I say risk transfer specifically and not insurance. And the reason is that risk transfer, as the name suggests, is when risk is shifted from being held by one entity to another entity that's better able to take on that risk. Insurance is a really common form of risk transfer, particularly in developed markets like the US, where policyholders pay a fee, that's their premium, in order to then get a payout, right, when something bad happens. And so insurance is essentially like income smoothing. You take a little bit in the good years so that you get protected against a larger financial loss. But the reason I like to focus on risk transfer is because it's so much broader, and there's a lot of other models for doing this, different ways to kind of share risk within a group. And this goes back like through human history, right? Like early bands of foragers would pool the risk of food shortages by combining food, and that allowed some people to do more risky hunting, knowing that there would be other sources of food if that failed. And it's still the case today that insurance is what enables a lot of high risk, high reward activity to take place that wouldn't take place if people had to hold that risk themselves. And there are different arrangements and cultures around the world where we still see sort of these systems of reciprocity that can function as a risk pooling mechanism. But on the other end of the spectrum, risk transfer also includes instruments that that kind of transfer risk into the financial markets. So things like catastrophe bonds. These aren't technically insurance either, but they are another way to transfer risk that's too large for an entity to hold on their own. And I think there's been a lot of creative development in that space as well. And so these and other types of approaches, I think, hold a lot of promise in this moment of extending insurance and the protection that it provides to groups that currently don't get it, for types of losses that aren't currently covered. So we're thinking about all of them. And I guess the last thing I want to say is that beyond just identifying the most appropriate and effective risk transfer solution for a given place, a given population, and a given risk, I've been spending a lot of time in recent years thinking about the role these mechanisms play in meeting our broader social and environmental goals. And that's the purpose of Insurance for Good. How can we align these approaches with our goals of a nature positive economy and a just energy transition and securing more resilience and more equitable recoveries? So yeah, I think I'll wrap up there. I think that kind of gives a picture of some of the stuff I've been thinking about lately.
Silly me. Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you so much for identifying where and where you sit within this adaptation space in the recovery, but also for sort of this big picture perspective on where insurance fits within risk transfer and addressing risk in human history. That's awesome. Aditi, we'll turn to you, and hopefully you can bring in more of the outside of the United States perspective.
Thanks, Alicia. Thanks so much for inviting me to this excellent webinar. My name is Aditi Mukherji. I work with the CGIAR. CGIAR is the world's largest publicly funded agricultural research organization, and we work in over 80 countries in the global south. right from Latin America to Africa, and that's where I'm currently based. I'm based in Nairobi right now, and we work in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So I am a researcher and currently in leadership position, but my career started actually understanding things like why do farmers do what they do? That has been something, one of the motivating things, like, if farmers have the option of cultivating this crop versus that crop, why do they choose a particular one? Or if they have a option of making more efficient use of water, why don't they quite do that? So those are the kind of puzzles that has motivated me right from the time of my PhD. So almost 20 years ago, I got my PhD from Cambridge. This is the UK one across the pond. And then there I looked at literally how irrigation reduces risk. So Caroline, I can see kind of quite similarity in, I also look at how to reduce risk for agriculture, perhaps not directly in the insurance form, but large part of my work has been around water management and irrigation, and have looked at things like how do policies determine what smallholder farmers do and the important role of policies and institutions in that. Then from that, of course, all throughout this, I think capacity has been an underlying theme. Knowing that with the same amount of knowledge, with the same amount of perhaps knowledge as well as background, different farmers have responded to the same incentives differently. And I think the underlying capacity to adopt new things or other incentives have been quite central to those decisions. And then I think around 10, 15 years ago, increasingly, as it was clear that climate change, water is a very central part of climate change. I have started working a lot around climate change adaptation in terms of how can water be a vehicle for that climate adaptation. I was a part of the IPCC, the last assessment cycle that just ended in 2023. And in that led the water chapter of the working group 2, where we looked at water-related vulnerabilities and how adaptive capacities matter in managing water-related risk that emanates from climate change, but also from other socioeconomic risks. And currently, I work across the whole CGIAR. We have around 15 centers in the CGIAR, and my work involves bringing together our climate-related work under one umbrella. And in that, what's quite interesting is with all these 15 centers, when we put that whole picture together, what we do is kind of an end-to-end risk management where adaptive capacity and capacity building are important pieces of the puzzle. So let's take the example of drought, for example. So we have our colleagues who work on how to reduce risk even before a drought strikes. And that work is through, say, early warning systems or through hydrological modeling. Then we have our other colleagues working what happens during the drought. How do we reduce vulnerability of farmers facing droughts, or how do we improve their adaptive capacity? So that would include things like on-farm water management, or it would include things like new seeds or drought resilient seeds, for example. So CG does a lot of work around breeding. Then we also work on what happens after the drought. So a lot of the work is also around insurance, but it's also mostly around bundled insurance, but it's also about how do we go back and feed all these work that we are doing into government policies so that we have better drought protection policies. So that's the kind of work that I am currently involved in, looking at this, putting these pieces of the puzzle together of how do we as an organization whose main agenda is food security for all, work with smallholder farmers, livestock, and fishermen and fisher folks to reduce all kinds of risks, particularly climate risks. So back to you, Alicia.
Oh, I am not. Thank you, Aditi. Yeah, for me, I often think of the CGIAR as sort of the people that are doing the most in terms of thinking through, well, how do farmers both reduce their risk going into a system? How do we reduce the sort of baseline risk that farmers are facing by just figuring out how these development systems can become more robust? And then, of course, it sounds like in ex post too, the CG system is doing more and more. So we really look forward to hearing more about that. Claudia.
Thank you, Alicia, and hello, everyone. Good to be with you. So my name is Claudia Thyme. I'm currently Senior Advisor on Strategy, Partnerships, and Engagement for an organization called the Insurance Development Forum. I'm also on the governing board of the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership and a member of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, MCII. Before that, I was about more than 25 years in the insurance industry in roles related to strategy and market development. And I had the question, which I thought the audience would be asking themselves, what does insurance have to do with sustainable development? But I think that both Carolyn and Aditi have already very clearly hinted to it, so I'm thankful for that. But to share that the Insurance Development Forum is a public-private partnership that is led by the insurance industry, but it's co-chaired and co-chaired by the UN Development Program and by the World Bank. And it aims to expand the use of insurance and its broader risk management capabilities in countries in the Global South affected by climate change and other natural disasters, with or seen as an integral part of achieving more sustainable development and the UN Strategic Development Goals. And the work, which is focused on implementation, engagement, and advocacy, is driven by the following premises. One is that countries affected by climate and other natural shocks need to understand their risk, the risk of facing the shocks in the future, as a central need to be able to manage them effectively and through adaptation, and also to increase their resilience using different tools, of which, of course, insurance is only one. Second, that the use of insurance capabilities to close what we call the protection gap is integral to achieving greater economic stability for these countries and greater resilience for their populations, governments, governmental entities, etc. And then the fact that also given the size and dimension of the challenge, addressing this needs public-private collaboration. I think my previous panelists have mentioned that already. In terms of my experience, especially relevant to these panels, in a previous role with the IDF, I have operationalized something called, it's a landmark program called the Tripartite Agreement Program, which was set up with IDF, the insurers, the UN Development Program, and the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ, to deliver on these goals for 20 Global South countries by contributing, on the one hand, the expertise of insurers to develop insurance programs for them, and on the other hand, the UNDP teams in country to place risk financing at the center of this country's fiscal planning, but also to help drive sort of adaptive governance in these countries to enable greater resilience, but to enable the use of insurance expertise, really. My background is not at all technical in terms of insurance or development. I'm a graduate of Georgetown and of the London City University Business School. So really it's more about business. But I have been working in this area since about 2018, hence joining you here today. So thank you, Alicia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Yes, foregrounding one of our future panels on governance capacity. I think we'll be especially interested to hear more about what have been sort of the key strategic challenges of building these public-private partnerships, especially among sort of international finance and local governments on centralizing risk in their financial planning. So would love to hear more about that as we go forward. All right, so the plan for the rest of the session today is to do a couple of round robins, first focusing a little bit for a while on a success story that each of our speakers has hopefully thought about, teasing out what it really took to build an adaptive capacity example. And then we'll get into a few challenges broadly in building adaptive capacity and talk about that for a little bit. So I think we'll do the same order of round robin, but we may break in and out a little bit more, and feel free to ask each other questions as well. But starting with Carolyn, we'd love to hear about your adaptive capacity success story and who was involved and what made it successful.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thank you. Before jumping into it, I want to just add a little bit more background on insurance. And Claudia, I'm sure you'll have things to add to this, and Aditi from the ag perspective, but just to kind of explain the project that I'm going to talk to. So there's a growing body of, and this is more of a US perspective, so I'm hoping they can provide the more global perspective, but there's a growing body of research that insurance is really critical to recovering from disasters, right? And as the risk of climate-related extremes is increasing and more people are having to suffer through those disasters, I think it's a really important part, as I think this whole panel does, about securing adaptive capacity. And we see in our own research that those with insurance end up having fewer unmet needs and fewer financial burdens in the short and longer run. Other work finds they have faster recoveries, they're more likely to rebuild. Lack of insurance can widen income inequality, so some of these challenges are really interrelated. And also there's benefits beyond the household. We see in our work, for example, that as more people in a community have insurance, they're able to engage in the local economy faster and more fully. So we see visitations to local businesses increase. And we know, of course, there's important links into our housing and mortgage markets. And of course, the reason for that's intuitive. There's no other good source for dollars here in the US and in many, many countries around the world. Most households have nowhere close to enough liquid savings in order to cover the huge cost of a disaster. Access to credit can be important and very beneficial for some households, but we also know that for many, taking on additional debt post-disaster is not possible or burdensome. We know here in the US that as income goes down, loan denials go up post-disaster. They don't meet the basic requirements. And also in many places, again, here and around the world, aid is simply insufficient or too delayed or not matched to need. Here, it was never designed to replace insurance or to bring people back to pre-disaster conditions. And we know without any type of financial safety net that these hazards create really downward financial spirals. Households can default on loans, accumulate debt, exhaust their savings. They might have to engage in really costly coping strategies in order to get the needed dollars for immediate recovery. And then that can have negative spillovers because they pull dollars from other important things like medical care or housing. And so that's why there's also a bunch of research showing that when you have the financial resources, it's linked to physical and mental health, emotional well-being, educational attainment, and the stability of families. So this is all why it's really, really important. And the project I want to talk about is that even in the US, where we have like generally a robust insurance market, there are populations without access to insurance at all. And there are certain types of economic needs that are not well covered. So for example, most of the insurance that you can get here is for property losses, which is great when you face property losses. But there are some populations where their biggest concern is not property. Like for renters post-disaster, we see that they often struggle with higher rents because, right, supply goes down, demand goes up. Usually we see a shock in rental prices. And so that's just not well covered. So we were looking at some of these gaps and what they meant for people's recovery in New York City, working with partners, the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, which is an affordable housing NGO, the Mayor's Office for Climate and Environmental Justice, and some private sector partners, Guy Carpenter, Swiss Re, and ISI. And this was a NSF-funded effort to try to come up with some insurance solutions to help fill gaps. And we realized that, there's not one product that meets every need. There's a lot of unmet needs post-disaster, and a lot of people struggle. And so we had to really narrow in and be specific about what problem we were really trying to solve. And the problem we ended up trying to solve, based on some surveys and some other and conversations with people in disaster recovery in the city, was one on the need and one on the peril. So on the need, we were trying to figure out how to get dollars to households for the immediate needs they have after a big disaster event. So we wanted money like in the days to weeks timeline for things like evacuation expenses or additional transportation or generators if the power is out, or lost income if your job is interrupted, and so on. So non-property expenses. And then we wanted to focus on rainfall-related flooding because in New York City, the coastal areas actually have pretty good protection from our federal flood insurance program. There's pretty good take-up and they pretty much need that type of protection. But the city, from climate change, is seeing lots of increases in intense precipitation events that overwhelm the local infrastructure and cause flooding in areas where people, to talk about risk assessment, don't know they're at risk, weren't prepared, didn't have any protection, and also for populations that couldn't afford any financial protection. So we ended up designing a parametric product that the Center for New York City Neighborhoods purchased. And they essentially are using it to finance an assistance program so that they also set up something called their Flood Recovery Fund that can make immediate grants to households to cover those post-disaster needs when they arise. And they're using the parametric risk transfer instrument, it's actually a financial product, to finance that. And we've now seen it replicated in Miami as well. So I think it's been, you know, I don't know, we could spend more time talking about the lessons, but I think it's been we learned a lot on what works and what doesn't. And I also think we need to do a lot more of this kind of creative thinking to test out solutions to figure out how we fill these capacity gaps as our risks just keep growing.
So dig a little bit more in there on what did you learn, what works and what doesn't in building these kinds of instruments?
Yeah, well, one thing, one big challenge, and I'm curious actually how both Claudia and Aditi see this in their work, is that the people who need this protection the most can't afford it. And also philanthropy doesn't seem to really want to be paying premiums long-term for people, although that has happened, I know, in other places around the world. And government doesn't. So where do you get the premium support, even when you know that this can provide such important benefits? That was one. And the second one that I'll raise is this challenge of kind of, I was saying risk transfer is this broad thing and there's financial instruments. Well, what we ended up purchasing was technically a derivative because it technically doesn't fall under insurance regulation here. And that was a little scary, I think, for a lot of participants in it. There's particularly in some, you know, frontline communities, I think there's a lot of skepticism about big finance, about financial instruments, especially coming out of, you know, thinking back like derivative triggers thoughts from the financial crisis. And so explaining that this is actually like insurance and that it's structured like insurance and that it's not some speculative exploitive product also took, you know, some doing and making sure we did structure it well. So, oh, and the third challenge was how to design a trigger for inland flood, but that's kind of a technical problem. But could I actually pass it to Claudia and Aditi, because I'm sure they've seen that same challenge, especially around premium, and I'm curious. But Alicia, I don't want to get off our round robin.
Yeah, no. Well, we can. We'll go to Claudia just because that's a direct insurance question, and then we'll loop back around to Aditi.
Well, to address the issue of affordability, certainly, Carolyn, that's something that I can relate to. And from the IDF, imagine working with countries in the Global South, affordability is even lower, whether you're talking about vulnerable people, but also governments that have extremely high levels of debt after the economic crisis and COVID crisis of the recent years at the moment, particularly. For Global South, there are donor countries, right, G7, G20, that in fact the Global Shield, which may be familiar with, has actually put in place a pillar for premium financing. Having said that, we all know, and being in the US is different, right? Because what we look to build is robust, sustainable insurance markets locally, right? If you have a program that needs to be always funded from the outside, that's not going to be sustainable, but it does help for the initial years, particularly in crisis affected areas. But I'll come back to more of that. So if you want to go back to your round robin, Alicia.
No, why don't we
want me to
go ahead and answer the same question?
So I, in a way, Carolyn, you referred to a lot of things that we deal with as well. I would like to take it maybe to a level more concrete with a little example, because I'm not sure how much people listening to us are familiar with this. So picture this, a city in Africa where there are neighborhoods where people live just above the poverty level, right? And they get by, you know, from small jobs or maybe very, very small business. And a flood hits. And that means that they lose their houses. Small businesses damage at least. And on top of that, for a while, they're isolated, right? So people that may need access to medicine don't have it, and so a treatable illness can become very life-threatening. help to recover, to rebuild and recover, as Carolyn mentioned, is slow to arrive. Often from studies from humanitarian sector done by the Center for Disaster Protection in the UK shows that funds, actual dollars, take about a year to arrive in disaster hit areas. And so because that is slow, and the government is scrambling usually to organize and access funds, sometimes, as I said, more than a year, the damage that goes untreated to certain structures can become permanent, right? Total damage. So people become dependent on social support if that's available, or charity, or worse. So the impact of disasters is amplified by the lack of funding, particularly initially, to address its effects. The state, on the other hand, because we work a lot with sovereigns, whether it's national, city, or regional governments, the state in such a situation faces a whole region impacted by flood and has to use funding, let's say, that was earmarked to build new schools, for emergency relief and to rebuild destructed structures. The loss of small businesses actually means that a portion of the population is no longer sustained economically. And so they may need to increase their debt, or they may default on their debt as a result. So the shocks not only halt development, but actually often they actually move it backwards. Now picture this, an alternative scenario. There's parametric insurance in place in this flood region, which means that when an excess rain parameter, that's what parametric insurance means, right? It goes by an index. So when that is reached, that triggers a payment to the government for emergency relief and for to protect essential infrastructure. And those payments can come within a week, and sometimes faster than that. That means that reconstruction can start faster. In addition, the local government has a disaster preparedness plan, which helps officials to move more quickly to provide relief. And people and businesses recover more quickly. And by the way, a study from Oxford University shows that communities that have insurance in place recover on average a year faster than those that do not. And every 1% of insurance penetration accelerates recovery by about 6 months. But let's go to the example. You wanted an example.
Yes.
So the IDF has designed a sovereign parametric insurance for urban floods in Ghana, for the greater Accra metropolitan areas. They call it GAMA. The goal was mainly to strengthen local disaster risk management and to accelerate recovery. The policy holder in this case would be the Ministry of Finance, right? So even though it's for vulnerable people and businesses, it's the ministry that would buy the insurance. The beneficiaries are these vulnerable households and in low income and also informal settlements in this region. And so it could also include small businesses. The insurance program was designed by a consortium, an IDF consortium of 3 global insurance, with their teams in the region, working with the Ghana Ministry of Finance, the National Disaster Management Organization, and the National Insurance Commission. Then the plan prioritizes funds, as I said, for flood relief, emergency shelter, things like non-food relief, but also logistics services, environmental sanitation, and hygiene promotion as well. So it goes from the beginning to also livelihood, restoration of teaching and learning materials, restoration of official infrastructure. UNDP, its insurance and risk finance facility, has trained in this project about 40 professionals from the region and the ministry in climate and disaster risk financing. And it also worked with the Ghana Insurance College to roll an inclusive insurance certification program. It worked with this National Disaster Management Organization to conduct a series of simulation exercises to test their contingency plan that we helped the project help develop. And there are plans in place for further capacity development. What made this sustainable, can make this sustainable, is the fact that on the one hand, the work was done with these local organizations, the ministry, the disaster management organization, rather than for. Often what a government decides to buy insurance is done somewhere, and then the product is put on the table and they take it to market, but they are not involved in it, which means there's no chance to learn, there's no chance to understand. The work of UNDP continues in each country also after the insurance solution is designed, after the project ends. And finally, in addition to that, the Ministry of Ghana, through the Global Shield, has applied, among other things, to participate with the Global Risk Modeling Alliance, which is something the IDF also initiated with the V20, to learn to develop their own risk models to better understand and manage the risk in the future for agriculture, for coastal resilience, and for urban resilience. So there is a continuum of work once this was initiated. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Claudia. Aditi, we'll turn to you.
Yeah, hi. I can start a little bit with my very limited experience in insurance. Actually, paying upfront premium is a challenge with the farmers and livestock herders that we work with. In India, for example, the main way in which farmers take up insurance is often as a default if they have taken a crop-specific loan or any kind of rural loan for any product, say crop or machinery, then insurance kind of is inbuilt into that loan product. So that's how majority of the insurance cover actually occurs among smallholder farmers. So I think upfront payment remains a big challenge. But my example was not exactly insurance, but it was largely in the front of risk reduction through irrigation while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the example I want to give around adaptive capacities was around some of the work that we did in International Water Management Institute, which is also a part of the CGIAR. So we had this project funded by the Swiss. It's called the Solar Irrigation for Agricultural Resilience. And in one of the states in India, Gujarat, which is a semi-arid state with very extensive dependence on groundwater irrigation, the government introduced solar irrigation pumps, and these were quite special ones because those were connected to the electricity grid. So this is a state where majority of the farmers have electric tube wells, which they pump groundwater to irrigate the field. And I know Alicia is very familiar with it. She has done field work in the same state. So what's happened is in the Indian context, often giving electricity to the farmers, which is largely subsidized, is one of the main reasons why our electricity utilities are often in red. They don't make a lot of profit. They cannot charge farmers full cost recovery for various reasons. So, and at the same time, electricity used in irrigation is also one of the major sources of greenhouse emissions in the Indian agriculture context. There's a lot of groundwater use in India. So what this state then did was it introduced solar irrigation pumps and it connected them to the grid. And it told the farmers that you have the choice of either pumping groundwater to irrigate your field, or you could also sell back some of the electricity that you were generating via your solar pumps back to the grid, and you could be paid for that. So, I mean, in many ways, it is a very, very, very wonderful scheme. And when we started looking at it, we figured that a lot of the farmers were still ending up. I mean, ideally, if a farmer was managing, he or she was managing their electricity and their pumping optimally, they would actually can make money by selling some of the electricity to the government. But instead, we found a lot of them were getting very high inflated electricity bills from the government because they were using more than they were pumping, and which was a bit funny because it should not have been that. And there was also an app, quite a nice app that each one of them had on their smartphone. And when we started interacting with the farmers, we realized that they hadn't quite understood the mechanics of the scheme. There wasn't an extensive capacity development before the scheme was launched. So all it took was like a series of trainings where we kind of, looked at just did simple, and these farmers are very smart. I mean, it's not that they would not understand if things were explained to them. So once they understood that there is an optimum level of water use beyond which they can sell the electricity to the government and they can actually get paid well, I think that entire dynamics changed. And we found that farmers were producing more electricity via solar irrigation pumps. They were pumping less water, which was a huge kind of a co-benefit, because these are also very overexploited, groundwater overexploited regions. Then we also found that as a result of some of these capacity sharing activities, extensive ones, we did face-to-face trainings, but we also then had some that we did more remotely through use of apps and use of various messages via SMS and smartphones. What we found was also farmers were even making decisions on when not to irrigate at all. So in one part, the most dry part of the state called Saurashtra, if they knew early on that there was a bad rainfall year, they decided not to cultivate at all, but actually use their pumps to completely generate solar electricity and sell it and get decent income. So I think that was a very good eye opener even for the electricity agency, because they had not quite realized that their beautiful scheme was falling a little bit apart simply because farmers hadn't quite figured out how to kind of run the system. And it wasn't a very difficult to make the farmers understand. It was just something that you gets launched quickly, and that happens very much with many government and even other schemes. We kind of run things very fast without completely understanding if the beneficiaries, the recipients, have understood how this works. So for us, that was a very eye-opening experience, that a simple capacity sharing thing had a huge impact in terms of all the indicators. So I'll stop there, Alicia, and talk about the challenges later.
Yeah.
And
So-
give maybe another example. Yeah.
So all of you, actually, each and every one of you mentioned the importance of engaging kind of with your end user, with your local community to get this right. If you didn't do that, then it wasn't going to work. But you kind of just left it at that. You need to engage. So just 3 sentences from each of you, going Carolyn, Claudia, Aditi. What did it actually mean to like sit down and do this engagement? I think we often leave it at that, but how did you design a meeting structure, actually effectively make this engagement happen? Because so often that sort of last mile problem remains the missing link in a lot of this.
Yeah, sure. Good question. I think, well, I guess I want to say a couple things. One is that I think that doing this type of work, as everyone's been talking about, really requires these close partnerships and needs to begin with the problem, not with the solution, right? And figure out how to solve it. And so I think that requires this type of engagement you're talking about. For us, I mean, I think it's important to note that partnerships take time to develop, and we'd actually been engaged with the mayor's office in New York City for years, talking about climate and insurance and some of these things before we got to the place where we were like, hey, maybe we should think about innovative ways to solve these problems and figure that out. And I'd say one thing that I felt like I took away from the experience and influenced some of the work we're doing now in Insurance for Good is that it's easy to talk about partnerships, but like the very tactical things really matter for success. Like someone has to schedule the meeting and get everyone there and do the follow-up and write the thing. Like, like it doesn't, and often no one in the partnership ecosystem owns that, right? Or has that as their job description, or has the time or the resources to do that. And so it often requires an entity, and that's what we're trying to do in Insurance for Good, to be able to be that player to kind of make sure things move forward. And also we found in the kind of work that we were doing that you hit so many roadblocks if you're trying something new, right? And often that's again where you need someone in the partnership to kind of own it, because sometimes like the communities that we work with, they don't have the time to knock down roadblocks when they have other day jobs, right? And so having someone to do those things, but in close dialogue to make sure you're aligned and point in the same direction is important. I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but that's okay.
I think that's incredibly useful. Thank you. Claudia.
I think agree with everything that Carolyn said. I would, in 3 sentences, I would say first, right stakeholders. It depends on also, for example, for us working with insurance, whether we're doing a sovereign solution, led by the government, but we have something similar to what was mentioned actually by Aditi, I'm sorry, regarding the agri solution. So if you're doing something like that, you have on the one hand the ministry, on the other hand you need the communities, the associations of the farmers. If you're doing inclusive insurance in a city, it's going to be very different people. There's universities that know, but we also need to work, for example, with regulators so that they understand what needs to be changed so that, for example, parametric insurance can be used, or a government can buy insurance which doesn't benefit them, it benefits a third party. So there's a lot of stakeholders that are relevant. You need to get them all around the table. Secondly, inform a lot and explain as much as necessary. Do not assume prior knowledge. I think that's key. When you have a lot of stakeholders, and I think sometimes we in insurance are guilty of that, and every industry, right? You have a lot of abbreviations and terminology, and the same terms mean different things depending on which side you're coming from. And third, take time to gain trust. Particularly when you're talking about public-private partnerships, but also global south and global north, right? It takes trust to actually share information and work really, hand in hand or elbow to elbow to develop a solution that will be sustainable. That's the three things I would mention.
Thank you. And Aditi.
Yeah, I think Caroline and Claudia have covered most of it. Maybe I'll just say one thing. It's the importance from a research perspective, the importance of spending considerable time in the field. There is nothing called remote research. We figured what was happening only when we were with the farmers, and we had already spent a lot of time with the officials trying to understand how the scheme works. And when we were with the farmers, also understanding that farmers were going through by some of the big announcements that were possibly made by the political leaders who had told them the best case scenario that you would get whatever 100,000 rupees in your account every year, and they kind of not really understanding how the scheme works. So a simple discussion actually made us realize that if they do a thing like change the time when they were pumping, instead of pumping early in the morning when the solar generation was low, or late in the evening again when the solar generation was low, if they pumped more during the peak solar time, what they were doing was they were managing their irrigation needs, but they were also generating excess energy which was going back into the grid. So I think in our case, a lot of it was understanding the technicalities of how the program ran, which the engineers understood very well, and understanding the practicalities of how a farmer manages his or her water. So a lot of community engagement and being on the field. So that's all I have to add to the excellent points both of you have made.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to jump into our second round robin. And I think in this round robin, think about the challenges specifically, not just for governing projects in general, but when you're really worried about helping vulnerable communities adapt either ex post or ex ante. What is it that keeps you up at night? And this can be specific to this project that you mentioned, or bigger systems level challenges that we're facing. Obviously, there are a lot of them. So just generally, the world is on fire is probably too general, but something more in that middle category of challenge. Aditi, I'll let it go back around and start with you if you're okay with that.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I actually wanted to come back to another example of some of the work we did when I used to work with ICIMO. That's a International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. That's an amazing organization that works in 8 Hindu Kush Himalayan countries. And one of the big challenges we were trying to solve was drying of the mountain springs. Some of it was anthropogenic climate change, and some of it was also unsustainable use like deforestation, etc. So we got a nice program with hydrogeologists, with local knowledge holders to know exactly how to recharge those springs. So that part was not difficult, but then what we realized was that there was a lot of inequity in the way those springs were located. So the villages often were, and this is like all throughout the Hindu Kush Himalayas, India, Nepal, and many other countries. A lot of the way these water is organized is based on caste system, which means that some of the more the more of the poorer communities, the so-called lower caste, actually are often rely on more marginal springs, which are a bit away from the main village settlements. Anyway, these are mountain settlements, already very remote, and within that there is another layer of inequity in terms of ethnicity, caste, etc. And when we were trying to look at the resources, we all know is always limited, and you have to always prioritize which are the ones that you want to revive through your science. And it always turned out that people wanted to revive the springs on which majority of the people depended, but the majority of those people were also a bit more well off than this minority group who often were much more secluded from the main settlement. So we realized that how easy it is to miss out the real vulnerable people because of the criteria you might select in terms of, where to put your scarce resources in. So I think we got, again, through research and through immersion, we actually understood that water is something that's still very, very determined by your a lot of other vulnerabilities. Who has access to water, who has not, is a very deeply contested kind of a issue. So understanding those is, I think, important, because often just doing a general focus group discussion will not tell you the whole truth of how those hidden inequities still operate in this day and age. So that for us was a very eye-opening exercise, to be very, very careful about understanding vulnerabilities. As outsiders, it might look that the entire remote village is vulnerable, but even within that, there are spots of more vulnerability.
And
yeah.
I was aware of that project as you were doing it, but since that project has the work you did to revive those springs helped as Nepal has faced increasing flooding, increasing droughts? How has the project responded, and has it helped the most vulnerable communities to respond?
So my colleagues in EC mode continue to work on these spring revival projects all throughout the Hindu Kush Himalayas. We had started in a small way in Bhutan, where I think things were a little bit more equitable. We had done some work in Nepal and India, and now EC mode is kind of promoting this work all across. It has become one of their major programs. And equity was in the way we then designed, we had a manual around stepwise. I think it was 8 steps of spring revival. One of the steps was literally about understanding the equity aspects of it, understanding that access to water is also entwined with many other societal factors. So how to identify which spring is to be revived. We had a number of kind of criteria to look at, and should not always go by the number of people dependent on the spring alone, but to look at some additional things. So I would think that there has been a bit of mainstreaming of these ideas, and India anyway had a very big program on Himalayan spring revival, but other countries of the Hindu Kush Himalayas have also picked it up.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Claudia.
So I was thinking in terms of the challenges, that you could look at them from different perspective, right? So if I'm thinking from the position of a country that is funding some of these efforts, one of the challenges that we also see as insurers and also from the IDF, changes in governments. You start a project and there's a change in government in the middle of it, because these projects take time, and teams and priorities mean sometimes that they're interrupted or delayed and a lot of time and expertise and effort is wasted. So that is actually quite challenging sometimes. Remember, we were at a summit last year promoting the idea that countries should have what companies have, which is like a chief risk officer, right? That's another aspect of it. And that's true also for global north governments as well, by the way. Someone that rather than risk being looked at from each ministry, agriculture or housing or whatever it might be, that there is an overall look across. From the point of view on the other end of vulnerable countries, right, that are looking to understand, to get help, one is access to expertise, because it is often not in the country, right, which is why IDF invests, and this is what we're talking about. But at the same time, access in terms of there's so many of us, there's a lot of organizations doing this work. Imagine you're a small country with a small team and limited resources. Whom do you talk to? How do you find them? And so I think that, for example, bringing different donor countries under the Global Shield has been a tremendous effort. Putting in place the Global Risk Modeling Alliance to help these countries actually understand their risks, that can enable them to get more financing into their country and to manage those risks in the right way. So that's really important. And finally, I mean, Carolyn mentioned funding, and there are organizations like the Global Shield providing premium financing, but I think it's ultimately is about sustainability of these programs over time, and it takes time to put them in place. But it is very much about the combination of all the things, bringing the expertise, convincing governments, gaining the trust, and all the different actors to actually invest time and energy in also building local markets, right? Strong insurance markets locally that help to stabilize economies.
Thank you. Carolyn.
Sure. These are all great points. I'm going to zoom out a bit and tell you two broad ones that bother me repeatedly. The first is just our tendency to myopia, right? Like we're very, as a species, prone to short-termism, and that just makes it really hard to motivate preparedness or capacity building in advance of a disaster or another challenge. And I think that's wrapped up in the fact that nobody likes to think about bad things happening, especially when they're not happening right now. And everybody's really busy and have other things, and carving out time for preparedness is when risks aren't imminent is really hard. And now when there's so much actually to deal with and so much distraction. But maybe more critically, we also know that many of our institutions, public sector and private sector, have baked in incentives for short-term thinking. And that leads me to what I think is another challenge, and it was mentioned in the background paper around creating governance structures. And I think an important goal across kind of domains is how to create institutions that reward long-term thinking. And that's been an uphill battle for like decades, and lots of people have thought about it and tried to do it, but it's really hard. And I think we need to keep pushing on it, especially as risks increase. And that's the last challenge I want to flag. I think it is very difficult for people and for institutions to wrap their minds around the fact that our failure to decarbonize has locked us into ever increasing risk. There's not some new plateau we can manage for, right? This isn't like some new design standard that we just have to adopt. This is like risks are growing year on year on year. And 2024 was the hottest year on record, and it might be one of the coolest that your kids experience. And I think that's sobering. And this is like constantly changing loss distributions. And I think generating profound implications for where and how we should be building on the design of our communities. Some risks are becoming much more frequent, like coastal tidal flooding as sea level rise advances. Some risks are getting more severe, so much so that we're seeing risks that are completely outside historical samples, like the recent LA fires, the Pacific heat dome a few years ago, where we're just seeing records being obliterated. But we're also seeing new risks that we're not used to dealing with, and that these institutions and things like insurance haven't been built for and aren't anticipating. So I'm thinking things like saltwater that was making its way up towards New Orleans. And there are lots of drinking water intakes throughout the East and Gulf Coast that are at risk for saltwater intrusion as sea level rise advances. That's really expensive and cannot be addressed overnight, and is not on the radar of most communities and feels like a distant, far off threat, but isn't going to be able to be handled unless we can do it in advance, right? So I'm kind of getting off here because it's something that I think is so challenging. And there are tools like scenario planning, horizon scanning, other types of kind of futures thinking things that I think can help. But we're not, at least in the context in which I work, we're not used to using them and how to integrate them. I think there's been more advancements in Europe and other places on them, but creating this shared culture of how we manage these risks in advance, I think is really important and a challenge.
Thank you, Carolyn. That actually responds really well to one of our questions from Jill Yeager on coping capacity and how do we get beyond just insurance as something that helps individuals cope with respect to single shock to something that's more systematic about how do we build adaptive capacity that helps communities as a whole respond and be prepared for shock. And I think a lot of that comes to answer that. But I think maybe from each of you, we can broaden the lens a bit and think, well, how do we move? How can your experience building adaptive capacity move to this more systematic group ability to respond to shocks and not just individuals? Claudia.
You know, one of the things that we look at, so if we think, for example, of disaster preparedness, right? It's been mentioned in this discussion, early warning, and early warning won't help you unless you are prepared and you know what to do, you know, with that extra time you get before a disaster hits. And one of the issues that with IDF we look at is the issue of ex ante financing of disaster response, right? Because I think Caroline mentioned, or Aditi, you know, with things like drought, you know well ahead of time that it will hit. You don't have to wait until that crop didn't, you know, turn out well. And even with something like hurricanes, right? We all know, particularly in the US, but all across the world, that there is a certain time of early warning. However, being prepared is much more likely to happen, people investing time, doing plans, doing, you know, rehearsals, etc., if there is funding for it, and if they know that once the disaster hits, there will be funding to deal with it quickly. So I think that is very key. Now, I'm sorry, because Alicia, I have to double check what your question was. I know that you were going to ask us what we learned from each other, but I'm not sure that I'm answering your question. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, I'm thinking about how we move, especially in the insurance examples, from strengthening individual adaptive capacity. I think you're answering
Yes, thank
to
you.
sort of a broader base societal capacity to
Right.
respond to shocks, so a greater coping capacity within.
Yes. So in addition to that thought that people are more
Yep.
likely to invest in preparing and learning how to prepare, is more likely to happen if they know funds are coming. I think a key thing is making funds available earlier, because today when disaster hits, as I mentioned, it sometimes takes a year until any funds get to an affected country or region, right? But insurance is not the only solution, but for certain types of risk and for certain countries, as Caroline said at the very beginning, you know, for a country or a donor country committing to pay those insurance premiums on a regular basis, it can be planned, you know how much it's going to be. And that means that when a disaster hits, the funds are there quickly. So thinking how to address disasters earlier and with funding that is actually put on the table before it hits, so that it's not the impacts of disaster are not amplified by this waiting of a year and sometimes longer until something can be done about it. I think it's critical.
Yeah. But Carolyn, talk to me a little bit about how we would not only sort of be prepared to respond to these shocks, but reduce vulnerability ahead of time.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something we've been thinking a lot about. And I think the intersection between that sort of pre-event risk reduction and insurance, I think there's a number of places that can play out. People are looking at things like premium incentives that reward loss reduction and different types of contingent financing that gives you the money in advance to invest in the loss reduction to protect yourself instead of the payout later. I think all of that holds promise. What I kind of want to talk to, though, is to unite that question with your other question about like moving from the household to the community, because I think we're seeing an interesting opportunity. And I mean, the way it's playing out is really kind of tragic, but emerging in the US around this, which is that in places of high risk right now, we're starting to see traditional models of insurance break. We're seeing insurers unable to provide enough capacity or provided at prices that people can afford. And then you don't have market clearing, the market breaks, right? And the answer to that, of course, in my mind, someone has to pay the cost of the risk. When the risk is high, there's no way to financially engineer your way out of that, right? It's not about tweaking our insurance at the margin, in my mind, to fix that. It's about investments in risk reduction, in resilience, in loss reduction, in climate adaptation, whatever you want to call it, that actually bring down the risk people are facing. And that's not just a household problem, that's a community problem. And I think, so that's where you kind of miss a few disconnects. When you're insuring individual properties, but the risk reduction that you need is at a community level, that can be hard. The incentives aren't always necessarily aligned correctly, but as more communities are seeing so many residents and small businesses struggle with the access and affordability to the coverage they need, I think that dynamic is starting to shift. And I think there's an opportunity, if insurers want to take it, to kind of lean into advising and helping communities understand the community level risk reduction that has to be done to create communities that are long-term insurable. And a long-term insurable community is one with lower losses that protects the residents, that protects the economy, that protects people's well-being. So I think we're at the early stages of how to get all those things lined up right, but it's definitely the right scale, that we need to be thinking. I don't know if that's totally responsive, but yeah.
And if I may compliment that, Alicia, I think that requires also changes in policy, right? Of one thing is disaster risk reduction. People tend to think of, levies to protect rising waters and so on. But it's not only about physical solutions. In that way, it's also about thinking, where should we be building? Is it right that we are continuing to build certain types of buildings in certain locations? And I think that as people see these big tragedies like the LA fires, hopefully there will be more awareness of that. But it's the policy making, but it's also driving people to understand what it can mean. It's not only about pricing, but it's about maybe moving sometimes.
Aditi, in the agricultural sector, have you seen mechanisms or strategies that have allowed adaptive planning to tie this reduction in vulnerability at the forefront to coping capacity mitigation that help mitigate disasters after the fact? Like, are there any projects that have integrated both of these pre and post vulnerability reduction and disaster recovery?
Right. So a lot of the work we do is actually about improving incomes and productivity for farmers. So our focus very much remains on how can we improve farmers or livestock herders or fisher folks' material condition. And something that you actually mentioned in your background paper is that being rich is one of the best, poor have less adaptive capacity than, having income. But I mean, unfortunately, it so happens that agriculture is not what you do to become rich in any part of the world, certainly not in the global south, but what it still you can do. So a lot of our investments in better yielding seeds, in better crop protection is trying to improve incomes of those farmers so that they have better adaptive capacity. So I think that is the crucial link. So, and now the challenge is within that you have to incorporate things like how do we reduce climate risks and a number of things. But I think the focus needs to remain on things like poverty alleviation, meeting the SDGs. So one of the things, yesterday I was in another webinar, and what I was trying to say is that climate action cannot be separated from meeting the sustainable development goals. Those have to go hand in hand. There is absolutely no adaptive capacity if people are living below the poverty line, which many of our farmers, smallholders in the global south still do. So for me, that's a very, very basic thing, that we have to improve incomes and material condition of the people we work with. So yeah, back to you, Alicia.
Okay, well, we're getting close to the end of our time. We have a really interesting question from Afrin Siddiqui on how can adaptive capacity be considered for compound or connected risks? What are the metrics that might be useful for such consideration? That's a tough question, so I'm gonna leave it up to you. We're gonna go around. You can answer that and something else interesting you learned in this seminar, you can answer only that, or you can just answer something else you learned in that seminar. But we'll each go around and have about 2 minutes. So again, the question from Afreen is, how can adaptive capacity be considered for compound or connected risks? And what metrics would we need to be able to think about that? And
Can I
or,
come in? Yes.
yeah,
Can I
what
come
you
in
learned.
very quickly on
Yeah.
the metrics? Just Afreen. Hi, Afreen. I think now with the UNFCCC, we have this global goals on adaptation. So a lot of us are actually working on those metrics. So what are those metrics for adaptation and risk reduction? So there is currently a technical expert group that is involved in coming up with these metrics. So I think there isn't an universally available metrics, but there are a number of ones. And again, I come back to how do we measure adaptive capacities, and actually reducing vulnerability to me is the core of those metrics. Like, what can we do to reduce vulnerability and the root causes of those vulnerability? I think what we have not spoken enough has been also the power imbalance and the inequalities and the intrinsic power imbalances. Very hard to measure, but worth trying to measure those. But just to let you know that there's a big global effort going on for constructing these global goals on adaptation, which is very much indicator and metrics based.
Thank you. Okay, I think Aditi got to Afreen's question. So let's go around, starting with Carolyn, then Aditi, then Claudia on something we've learned from each other, and then we'll let everybody get back to their day jobs.
Thanks. I guess a couple things. I want to maybe just stress again the conversation we were having about investments in risk reduction, and to come back to this thing about adaptive capacity and coping capacity, because we're often investing in coping capacity because we haven't done enough to lower our losses ahead of time. And I think continuing to figure out ways to drive the incentives to do that and to put in place institutional structures that will require consideration of how risk is increasing to change the way the risk actually is playing out on the landscape. So I'm thinking about things like, forgive the US context again, but like before development, you actually have to do a climate assessment about the future risks of that property and make sure it's a location that we should be building in and that it's built to safety standards for how those risks are going to change. And I think we're not investing nearly enough in those types of activities now. And then I think on the flip side, there's also ways to use the post-disaster context to improve things for the next one, right? And so we have a lot of structures in place through our aid programs and through traditional insurance models that put back what was there before as quickly as possible. And we need to really change that mindset. And we need to be not putting back the same thing when that doesn't make sense for our climate future anymore. And so how, again, we can change those incentives and institutions to allow us, because a lot of the restrictions we have in place right now require you to put back the same thing to prevent fraud and abuse. So they were put in for good reasons, but now they're really hindering our ability to make the changes we need. And so we've been spending a lot of time thinking about how you can change insurance policies, how you can change our aid policies, but more importantly, how you can change community mindset that we need to actually put in place something different so we can continue to thrive for the longer term. And so it's again about building that culture of managing our risks. And I think there's also a place in it, to Claudia's point, of being ready to retreat post-disaster when it's not a place where we can economically continue to live and it's not safe to keep putting people at risk. Yeah, so I think those are themes that we need to keep thinking about.
That's really interesting. And it segues nicely into our next seminar on transformative capacity. And one of the things that scholarship has found is that there is this essential tension between adaptive capacity and transformative capacity. And a lot of the people that are focusing on adaptive capacity and have institutional structures to make it happen almost get in the way sometimes of our ability to transform. I said we would go to Aditi next, right? Yes.
For me, what I learned was like the problems, particularly the climate related problems, are just so common. I mean, those, struggle with paying premiums upfront is something we see very much in the global south among smallholder farmers, was something you also see in urban communities in the US. And I think the scale of it might be different. I mean, the amount of premiums we are talking about would be in the actual number would be very different, but the patterns are the same. That how do we make these products more affordable is something I learned, that there is a lot of common things that we can all learn from each other from various sectors, from urban to rural, from global north to global south. So for me, I think that was my main takeaway, that this mutual learning needs to keep on happening because it's a tricky problem and none of us have all the solutions.
Thank you, Aditi. Claudia.
Hey, I think that maybe not learning, but conclusions. I love the example that Aditi talked about at the beginning about irrigation in a way as a disaster risk reduction measure, but also the fact that such concrete and effective measures like that sometimes need to be and are linked, right, to financial solutions. So if a farmer cannot afford that, how do you enable that? So the thought that no solution is a single path, as it were, that we need to bring sort of all the tools and all the knowledge together. And the second one, similar to what Aditi mentioned in regards to Carolyn's comment, right, about the fact that even in the US, it is the communities that need it the most that can least afford this insurance protection. And so I think that in relation to that, the global north is facing increasing risk as well, and the need to put protection in place for their own communities, disaster risk reduction, etc., which is going to need a lot of investment and changes. So to me, that makes it even more important and more critical to drive the global south's ability to sort of drive their own future. And in turn, that necessarily goes by looking at the current financial system that is prioritizing ex post financing of response to disasters rather than ex ante. I think that's critical. And I think a lot of the conversation today showed that.
Yeah, it sounds like, one of the early insights of adaptation scholarship that richer is safer is fundamental to all of this, which also means that insurance may only be able to do so much, and we have to figure out how we can also become a more equitable society moving forward. Without it, adaptation probably can only go so far. Thank you all for joining us today. We really, really appreciate your time. I just quickly wanted to thank the necessary people besides Aditi, Carolyn, and Claudia. You guys deserve the most thanks, but also to our team here at the Mousavi Rahmani Center for Business and Government, Claire and Victoria, thank you so much for making this all run smoothly behind the scenes. The seminar is organized by the Sustainability Science Program at the Harvard Kennedy School and hosted by the Mousavi Rahmani Center for Business and Government. We have our next panel coming up on March 12th, and a working paper for this seminar is available on the website where you're registered, or it will also be linked to in the YouTube video if you're watching this on YouTube. Thank you so much, everyone, and hopefully see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.